So what am I going to talk about? I'm going to look at the journey, a little bit of history, a little bit of context about the UK-Vietnam relationship. Then we'll look a little bit more at trade. We'll dive a little bit into the sector specifics, so what sectors are performing, where's the FDI going, and how the UK fits into that. There's quite a lot of rosy news because obviously, as we're all aware, Vietnam is developing and growing and its growth is accelerating. But obviously, like anywhere, there's always challenges. So I think it's good to be real, good to be realistic. So we will look at some challenges as well. And then it would be good for me to finish on actually who I am and what we do. So a little bit about BritCham and how we fit in to the picture that I've painted and talked about with regards to trade and economic development in Vietnam. So to start, I just wanted to put a little bit of context and a little bit of history, nothing too deep, and something that I'm sure we're all aware of. So 52 years ago now, in 1973, diplomatic relations between the UK and Vietnam started. That was very much from a political sense. The economy was still very much a centrally planned economy, so there was very limited trade, but that's where the story began for the UK and Vietnam. Then in 1986, things started to develop, and that's when the international community became more active in Vietnam with the Doi Moi reforms. And that is where the market economy started, and that's where we saw the first UK firms starting to enter, firms such as BP, HSBC, Standard Chartered. The next step in that journey for Vietnam was joining the WTO. And this really gave them the formal framework for trade. It gave global respect on how trade would happen and the regulations that would govern that. So that's really when Vietnam's doors opened for a much more commercial outlook, and it's where the growth really started. And since then, we've seen accelerated growth, and I have no doubt that is going to continue for the next 10, 15, 20, 25 years. It's certainly an exciting time to be in Vietnam. So that's just a little snapshot of how we started and developed the international relationship, and obviously the UK is part of that. I thought it was also a good idea just at the beginning to look at the two countries, because one of the reasons why our relationship is strong now and will get stronger is there's quite a lot of similarities about what the UK experienced and what the UK went through to what Vietnam is going through now. So from an economic perspective and from how the economy is made up, there's a huge majority of SMEs. So most of the economy in the UK and Vietnam is made up by SMEs. So how business is done and how the economy is driven forward, there are similarities there. Coastline, and actually the geography of the two countries is similar in the sense of how trade is done. We were very reliant on ports, London, Liverpool, Ho Chi Minh, Haiphong, Da Nang. So how trade started is very similar. So there's lots of sharings that have happened and will continue to happen. And I think the other important thing about the coastline aspect is something that I'll come on to a little bit later, is when we're talking about renewable energy. So the UK has developed a lot of offshore and onshore wind, for example, and Vietnam will be going through that as well. And there are things that they will learn from the UK. And BritCham, in collaboration with MOIT and the British Embassy, did an event with exactly that in mind. We had the Minister for Energy and Net Zero visit from the UK, and he was talking about how the UK developed, the stages they went through in developing their offshore, which is exactly what Vietnam is doing now. So there's a huge amount of knowledge sharing to do with the similarities of how the countries are developing. So to move on now to some of the specific milestones of the journey of the trade relationship between the UK and Vietnam. 15 years ago, in 2010, there was a strategic partnership signed by the UK government and the Vietnam government. This was the formal framework and the formal cooperation between the two countries. And it encouraged investment, education, and security. And it created those regulations and the ways of working from a global perspective for bilateral trade. And I think from a UK perspective, it also told industry that you could trust and respect Vietnam. And it was also essentially saying there's a huge amount of opportunity. That's why we are signing a strategic partnership. So that's where the formal relationship, the formal trade relationship started. And obviously, we are 15 years forward from that. So this year we are celebrating 15 years, and there will be various events, mostly orchestrated and organised by the UK Embassy and the British Consulate to celebrate those 15 years. In 2016, the UK made a decision to leave Europe. So that meant that we could no longer be part of the EU-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement. So in 2020, the UK-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement was signed, and this came into effect in 2021. So essentially it was very similar to the trade agreement that already existed with the EU, with slight differences. But again, that set up the framework to encourage bilateral trade between the two countries. And then an extension of that, which is an incredibly exciting extension, I will talk a little bit more about it in a few minutes, is CPTPP. This is a multilateral trade agreement. It's one of the biggest in the world. So this is where there are 12 countries that have signed up, and the UK has now joined. Vietnam was also already a member, and has been for a few years. So it now gives more opportunity for UK companies to trade with Vietnam and Vietnam companies to trade with the UK. So let's look a little bit more detail about what actually are those agreements. So the UK FTA, its intention is to remove 99% of tariffs. Basically, tariffs are a tax when something comes into the country that then makes it more expensive to the consumer. So the idea is you take away those, free trade, it's more competitive, and then in theory, there's more activity which benefits both countries. The FTA was staged for a schedule of 6 to 9 years. So by the 1st of January 2029, 98.3% of tariffs will be eliminated. So 98.3% of products and services to a certain extent that go either way, Vietnam to UK or UK to Vietnam, there will be no tariffs. In the early part of that timeline, the benefit was more towards Vietnam. From 2025, so now, to 2026, it starts to balance out to the UK. So I think we will see, over the next 4 to 5 years, as that comes to fruition, we will see increased trade from the UK and also with CPTPP. So what is CPTPP? And I've managed to say it about 4 times in the right order, which doesn't happen that often. It is the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. As I said, it's one of the largest free trade agreements. And what it really does is it builds on the framework of a bilateral agreement, which is when you just have another partner. CPTPP has 12 partners. So it gives you much more flexibility as to how you trade, who you trade, and what you do in those countries. And essentially for the UK and for Vietnam, it gives companies the choice of which agreement they use. So it's really benefiting the companies. And if something benefits the companies, that usually means it benefits the end consumer. So there is a system in the UK that exporters can put in their product or their service, and it will tell them which trade agreement is most competitive for them to use. So the introduction of CPTPP is giving much more flexibility and many more options to encourage, and essentially that's what it's there to do, to encourage trade. It officially came into force for the UK on the 15th of December 2024, so this is incredibly new, and there are 2 or 3 events coming up in the next few weeks run by the British Embassy and the British Consulate in Ho Chi Minh City on publicising and talking about these and how you optimise them and how you take advantage. Because as we all know, one of the big challenges, especially with government, is there are all these great things, but if you don't know about them, you can't take advantage of them. And they really are going to add huge tangible benefits to both Vietnamese companies and UK companies. So these are the 12 countries that are involved. So the founding members were Australia, Canada, Japan, Mexico, Singapore, and New Zealand. And then Vietnam was very much at the forefront and was next. And then we've got Peru, Malaysia, Chile, Brunei, and the United Kingdom. And you can see the others who are hoping to join as well. With regard to the relationship with Vietnam, another great thing that happened is that the actual signature by the UK and their acceptance by the other 11 countries was actually signed in Phu Quoc in Vietnam. So that again was another momentous occasion for UK-Vietnam relations. CPTPP represents nearly 13% of global GDP. That's a huge amount of trade. And if you're part of that, it gives you access to all those different countries. I mentioned about the flexibility and the difference between bilateral and multilateral. So one of the advantages for UK companies is, for example, they might manufacture something, a widget, in the UK. They then need to add an arm to that widget. That comes to a contract manufacturer in Vietnam, and then they can export that from Vietnam to Australia. So using CPTPP, they can go through 3 countries, but essentially, at some point, hopefully, it will all be tariff-free. So it gives companies much more flexibility, not only in cost, but actually where they do things and how they operate. So it really is it will have a huge impact on how people do business in CPTPP countries. So these 2 agreements are how the UK and Vietnam have come closer together. These are how they do business. So let's look a little bit at what that actually means in reality. Bilateral trade between Vietnam and the UK now stands at just over $8 billion between the 2 countries. There's obviously ups and downs, and obviously through COVID, levels were lower, but generally it is increasing. I think 3 years ago it was $6 billion. And with the introduction of CPTPP, we're expecting it to accelerate even more. So where's that money going? Pharmaceuticals and the healthcare industry, 400 million. This one actually surprised me when I got this statistic. Automobiles and machinery, 500 million. Beverages, F&B, 300 million. Financial and professional services, 1 billion. And then this is another surprising one, education and training services, 200 million. So that's UK exports to Vietnam. The UK now very much is a service-led economy. We do have a certain amount of manufacturing, but it is very much service-led. And there is some slight difficulty in sometimes establishing, because a lot of our financial services goes through Singapore. So sometimes, and we're English, so we don't really shout about how good we are. But sometimes it's a little bit difficult to put an exact number, but you can see financial services is by far the biggest. The interesting one, and we were just talking before, is education. So in my time in the chamber, I would say that education and healthcare are the two most active, biggest sectors. But actually, when you look at the numbers, that doesn't ring true. So that is quite an interesting statistic. But I think it is one that will accelerate and develop as time goes. And I think one of the reasons why I've seen a large amount of activity we've seen a large amount of activity in education and healthcare is due to the increase in the middle class in Vietnam. You have to be careful with statistics, but there is a statistic that in the next 10 years, 36 million more people are going to go into the middle class in Vietnam. What's the first thing people spend money on? Particularly in Vietnam, education and healthcare. So it's definitely a sector that is going to grow, and I'm sure for the management in Brighton College, you are seeing what that is meaning. There are more schools coming in. There is more competition. So, but it's not just schools. Education generally, whether it's qualifications, whether it's vocational, etc., etc. So, what goes back to the UK? I don't think there are any surprises here about essentially what those products are. A lot of it is the traditional sectors that Vietnam excels at. So garments, 1.9, footwear, 1.2 billion, electronics and machinery, 1.5, agriculture, 900, and furniture and wooden products, 600. I think we'll definitely see the electronics increase with the desire and the drive for a high-tech manufacturing hub. And textiles, I imagine, will continue to grow. And you will see from those statistics that what I said before rings true, is so that at the moment the trade balance is in favour of Vietnam. There will be various reasons for that. One of the reasons will be because of the free trade agreement. So I would expect and hope that we do see more coming in from the UK. So let's just step back and take another look at the bigger picture. Foreign direct investment is vital to any country, but particularly to a country like Vietnam that is accelerating at such a pace and has the lofty and ambitious targets that the government have set. Consistently, Vietnam has received a large amount of FDI, over 27 billion. In 2024, it was 38 billion. Where does that money go? It's actually spread across 18 out of 21 sectors, but it's disproportionately coming in. So just over 25.5 billion went into manufacturing, which accounts for 66.9% of total FDI. Real estate, surprisingly, maybe, gets the next 6.31 billion. And then wholesale and retail gets 1.4. So it's quite interesting to see the incredible amount of money that's coming in, but it's all going to one sector. And again, I was having a conversation before we came in this evening. Vietnam at the moment is a very interesting place economically when you look at some of the stats. So if you look at the top line stats, last year, GDP was 7.09%, which is incredible. But a lot of that is being supported by one or two sectors, which on one side is great because they are excelling, and that would be manufacturing, and that is reflected in why 66% of FDI is going into that sector. You could say you have to be a little bit careful, because if you have all your eggs in one basket, to use a very British phrase, then if something happens, then you're not going to be in a good position. And then the other way to look at it is, if we're growing at that rate with FDI going, that much FDI going into that specific sector, what happens when even more comes in and goes into the other sectors? What is our growth going to be then? So I'm definitely an optimist. That is what's going to happen. We are going to see more FDI coming in. It's going to be dispersed across other sectors, and I can see that's where the growth is going to be, and that's why the government and financial institutions are still very robust and confident in the projections for the future GDP growth. UK firms that have been here a long time and that you'll probably see that the big, so HSBC, Standard Chartered, Prudential from the financial services, they've been here a long time. They're very much established. I would say, not doing a disjustice to the UK, but maybe the UK was a little bit late to realizing what an amazing opportunity and what an amazing place Vietnam is. That is now happening, and we are seeing more investment. But some of the very forward-thinking global companies, like the ones I just talked about, have been here from the beginning and are now very much part of the development and growth of Vietnam. So let's look a little bit at the sectors. So where is this going and what's happening? As I just said, manufacturing still is a huge sector for Vietnam, both from an export perspective, but also from a domestic perspective. And that is also helping to drive and to grow and to develop the economy, because not only are exports very competitive going to the West, but the domestic market is also growing hugely. The stat, 36 million in the next 10 years going into middle class. People have more purchasing power. People are buying more. So Vietnam has a two-pronged. It's exporting more and it's buying more internally. Unilever, a big UK company, they've been here now for, I think it's their 30th, I think they're celebrating their 30th year this year. So they very much are making, again, for both markets. They're making for the export market, and they're making for the domestic market. Vietnam is incredibly competitive from a labour perspective. This is something that I think won't go, but we do have to be careful and watch, because we need to make sure that the competitive advantage stays, because labour costs are going up. And there are, when we look at the challenges, we need to make sure that the challenges are being rectified to make up for some of the other advantages that maybe are subsiding as labour costs increase. Manufacturing will always be a mainstay of the Vietnamese economy. As I said before, I think we're going to see a lot more in high tech. There's a huge appetite for that. And I think if they can start producing some of the components, if we can start producing some of the components in Vietnam, whether that comes from UK companies or not, then that is going to help that sector as well. The renewable sector. So I mentioned this at the beginning. when I was talking about similarities and links that Vietnam and the UK has. So I think it's 3,000 kilometers of coastline that Vietnam has. And there is a huge drive for green energy and sustainable businesses. As I said at the beginning, the UK has been through this and is seen as a leading expert with excellent experience in how to implement and the stages that you have to go through for these developments, whether that's the construction of them, whether that's feeding the power back into the grid. So this is a sector that is going to see huge growth. It's also a sector that has experienced a huge amount of lethargy in recent years. Eventually, 2.5 years ago, DPD8 was eventually released, which was the policy on renewables. But there is still a lot of work happening with that. And there is still, certainly, sadly, from a British perspective, BP, for example, they want to invest. There's a lot of investment that is coming, but there's still some work that needs to be done on the renewable sector. When that work is done, a lot from government, when that work is done, no doubt this sector will be huge. And I also have no doubt that the UK will be very much part of that. What are the UK doing now? So we are co-chairs with the EU for JETP, which is a 15.5 billion, essentially long-term loan that Vietnam has received. JETP, sorry, it's government, so it's full of acronyms. The Just Energy Transition Partnership. So this is for developed nations who have gone through this process to assist both financially, but also with expertise, the transition from traditional power to renewable power. And there's a lot of government exchange on energy. There's a lot of government. The UK, I would say, again, from my experience from doing this role for 3.5 years, the UK and Vietnam government are talking a lot on energy, are talking a lot on healthcare, are talking a lot on education, and are talking a lot about international finance and the International Financial Centre. So there is a lot of conversations going on business to business and government to government. So the infrastructure. Without infrastructure, it's going to be very difficult for your economy to develop. And again, this comes up in the challenges. Obviously, everything that I'm talking about is linked. So apologies if things keep coming back and I go off on a tangent. You'll see from where we are now. This is a fairly new development, new roads, new infrastructure, new schools, new hospitals. There's a huge amount of infrastructure developing, being built in the whole of Vietnam, whether that's road, whether that's rail, whether that's air, whether that's port. And I think one thing that's really interesting, and it's going to be interesting to see, and we all might have a slightly different opinion of this, Vietnam is growing so very quickly, which is amazing. But the infrastructure has to keep up with that. You know, if Unilever have a super efficient factory that can produce 10,000 widgets a day, but they can only transport, or it takes 2 weeks to transport because the infrastructure is not there, all the work and investment they've put into that super efficient production line is not going to benefit them. It has to go by road to the port, and then it has to be exported, or it goes by rail to the port. So what's happening now is the integrated infrastructure is being put in. The UK, again, have been heavily involved in a lot of the consultative process, and obviously we're trying from an industrial perspective and from a business perspective to be involved in the execution as well. Arup who are a UK-based company, very much from a consultancy perspective. They've been involved in a lot of infrastructure projects. And the UK government is also very active with the Vietnamese government. So I talked about a few moments ago, sorry, this is another tangent. I talked about a few moments ago kind of what, from my perspective, I think the government are talking to the Vietnamese government about. Then when I say talking, it's a lot of it is capacity building. So it's looking at what Vietnam is trying to achieve. It's saying, hey, we did that. This is what we learned. This is what we would do differently if we did it again. So there's a lot of engagement nationwide from the UK government and from business. Business is very much involved, and we are kind of going on to the end bit about what BritCham is. As a chamber, we are consulted and asked, and then we ask our members how this needs to happen, we want this to happen, how should it be done? How will it work best for you? So the government are talking to other governments, including very actively the UK, and they're also talking to business. And for things like infrastructure, that's vital. I mean, there's a lot in the news at the moment about high-speed rail. There's a lot of other countries that have got high-speed rail. So that's how you try and make the delivery of that efficient, and there's a lot of conversations with the UK government. So the financial sector, as I said before, is a huge sector for the UK, and it's one that is growing rapidly in Vietnam, and the National Assembly recently officially signed the decree for the development of an international financial centre and in Ho Chi Minh and a satellite financial centre in Da Nang. Essentially, it means nationally the regulations and the way the finance sector works will be developed, because that is one of the biggest things that FDI, that companies wanting foreign direct investment, sorry, I'm using another acronym, FDI, foreign direct investment. When an investment firm, whoever it might be, is investing hundreds of millions, billions into a project, they need to know that that money's safe. They need to know that there are assurances. And so the decision by the government to action the International Financial Centre is a fantastic hint, it's a fantastic, what's the word I'm looking for? It's showing internationally that they are serious. Now, it's going to take a long time. Developing an international financial centre is going to take a long time. But it shows the intention to develop the framework that will attract more FDI that the country needs to continue the development. And we will see many more UK companies coming in from a finance perspective, whether that's capital markets, bonds, banks. What will be interesting, I think, is how the digitalization of banking develops in Vietnam. But two, I've already mentioned HSBC, I've already mentioned Standard Chartered, I have already mentioned Prudential. They're some of the big named financial institutions, British institutions, that are in Vietnam. Healthcare and pharmaceutical. As I said before, the four main industries, health is one of the main sectors where we're seeing more and more activity. We're seeing more activity from the UK, and one particular company got an awful lot of attention for the work they did in Vietnam and globally, AstraZeneca, during COVID. The expertise and the experience that such companies as AstraZeneca, GlaxoSmithKline, UK companies have, there now is the increasing demand in Vietnam for the products that they are making. At the moment, it's export, but it's only a matter of time until companies like that are manufacturing in Vietnam. So that again is another sector that is going to develop very quickly. I think that comes back to the point of, why is that happening? Because of the development of Vietnam, because of the development of disposable income. So this is one of the sectors that I think has been the busiest, but that doesn't necessarily show in the figures that we looked at. And obviously a poignant topic because we are in Brighton College. I think the UK, I think we can safely say without being too over the top, the UK is known for its excellence in education and the whole spectrum of education. And it's a huge British export globally, not just in Vietnam. Vietnam is one of the 5 priority countries for education by the UK government. So they are seeing the importance of Vietnam, and Vietnam obviously is seeing the value of UK education. But it's not just, sometimes when we talk about education, we just think about K-12 schools. It's obviously higher education, it's qualifications, it's accreditation, it's professional development and training, it's vocational. So we're seeing more UK qualification bodies coming into Vietnam. I'm certainly seeing now in the last 6 months, I think I've probably spoken to, 10, 11 UK universities who are showing an active interest in Vietnam. Whether that's setting up a physical campus, but whether it's partnerships with Vietnamese universities, whether it's for undergrad or postgrad Vietnamese going to the UK, there's a huge amount of interest in Vietnam. Vocational education, I think, is something that we are going to see more of. And that links to one of the challenges that I'll come on to shortly. Something I was going to say at the beginning, but I didn't, is another aspect that is increasing the relation, or helping to increase the relationship between the UK and Vietnam, is there are now more and more Vietnamese students going to the UK to study. And also what we are seeing now is there are more and more Vietnamese coming straight back. So maybe going back pre-COVID, there were potentially the visas there were longer visas. So the stay time in the UK was longer. But also the economy in Vietnam wasn't where it is now. So we're now seeing a lot more UK alumni coming back to Vietnam and going into the workforce, which with it is obviously bringing increased experience, increased skills and knowledge, but also the connection to the UK, which for the UK government, which for us, for organisations like schools, institutions like Brighton College, that is great because there are more advocates, there are more connections, there are more people talking about the UK. And that has an impact. So as we see that grow, as we see that develop, that will also increase the connection. And obviously that will lead to business. That will lead to increased business. And I am now, sorry, I'm going off on another tangent, but it's kind of linked, bear with me. From a chamber perspective, one of the things we do is we offer business services, we call them. We help UK companies who are interested in doing business in Vietnam, or they have decided they are going to do business in Vietnam. We can help them with market access services, whether it's market research, whether it's finding partners, licensing, etc., etc. There are various services that we offer. That's always been one way, UK to Vietnam. But I'm getting more emails and phone calls from Vietnamese companies saying, we really want to export to the UK. We really want to set up an office in the UK. Can you help us? So for me and from a chamber perspective, that is a new initiative that we will be starting, because as Vietnam develops, more companies have the ability, have the need, have the desire to expand their reach and expand their presence. And the UK is becoming more on their map, more on their radar, and as more people come back and talk about the UK, et cetera, et cetera. So it's common sense, but it really does happen and it really does help. So education is something that I think we will continue to see grow, whether it's schools, UK universities, qualifications, vocational, English language. English is the second language in Vietnam. It is the global business language. So the English language centres, again, are only going to get busier, and there's only going to be more of them. So I hope from what I've been talking about, you have got from me that obviously, and you're here, you're living, you're working, you're studying, there's a huge amount of opportunity. There's a huge amount going on. Sometimes I wish there was less going on. I'm exhausted, but I wouldn't have it any other way. But there are challenges. There are challenges to business. And as I mentioned before, I think when we were talking about infrastructure is one of those challenges. So what are these challenges and where do we see them going? So regulatory, and we could probably bring in the legal system. So complex regulations and lengthy processes, maybe particularly to do with trade, importing and exporting, customs processes. This can have a negative impact on an organization's appetite to export to a certain country. And it's something that we have seen and has been experienced by many, many different countries coming into Vietnam. So it's important that those are modernized and developed and consistent. That's one of the biggest challenges that firms have. They import 20 containers 1 month and it takes a week. They have 20 containers 6 weeks later of exactly the same product, and it takes 6 weeks. There's no consistency. Now, interestingly, one of the elements that might have an impact on that, well, actually not might, will have an impact on that, is CPTPP. CPTPP, and don't worry, I won't bore you, I won't go into the details too much, but it doesn't just cover tariffs and actually the costs, but it also covers the frameworks and the regulations that countries have to adhere to when they are trading with each other. And some of those are related to customs and excise and timescales, documentation, etc., etc. So hopefully those agreements will mean that a company that's exporting from the UK to Australia or from the UK to Singapore and then decides to export to Vietnam will know exactly what the process is. Because if it's under the CPTPP agreement, it should be exactly the same. It should take the same amount of time. There should be the same documentation. We're on a little bit of a wait and see about that because I said the UK only officially came into force with CPTPP on the 15th of December. But I hope that that improves that aspect of one of the challenges that organisations are facing. Workforce skills gap. So we were just talking about education, and obviously we all know how important education is. Now this isn't a Vietnam problem or challenge. This is a global challenge. The UK had it as well. And again, maybe this is also where capacity building and experience comes in. You go to university, you learn, you go out into the wide world, and you're not yet quite ready for what your employer is requiring, which is fairly obvious. You've never worked before. But how can we close that gap? How can we make a more efficient transition from study through to employment? When I'm talking to companies about the challenges in Vietnam, there are three that come up every time: regulation, legal system, and talent. Now, talent is actually, sorry, another slight tangent, but hopefully relevant. Talent is a huge topic for Vietnam because of the pace of development. And this is where the UK can really excel because of its background and its knowledge and its experience in all facets of education. When we're talking, let's say, about renewables, it's a completely new sector. The International Financial Centre, that will be a completely new framework of how the finance system works in Vietnam. When you're talking about people, when you're talking about operating those systems, it has to happen now because it has to start, and then you have to plan for the future. So at this stage of development, there's a huge challenge because you need skilled, experienced people now, and then you need to train people for the future. So that's where the professional development, that's where education is going to continue. And that's why I think we will see the acceleration, because there are so many new sectors that are emerging that the education, and also, which is also sometimes a sensitive topic, the import of skill. So bringing international workers into Vietnam to work at certain organizations. But if you don't do that, you're not going to be necessarily up to speed and optimizing what you need to do now while you're training the future generation for 5, 10, 15 years' time. So the skills gap is a really important one. And there's a lot of students here. You are going to be parts of the future. You are the future. So it's great to see so many of you here, listening, learning, understanding, and hopefully it will start provoking some questions about what comes next. I talked briefly, and sorry, I've got no idea how long I've talked for, so I hope it's not too long, but Dr. Cyrus, do stop me if I am. I mentioned infrastructure limitations. Again, this is a consequence. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? I'd say it's a good thing. It's a consequence of how quickly Vietnam has developed. Building infrastructure takes a huge amount of time and investment. It's not, you don't build roads, deep sea ports, railway lines, airports like that. It takes time, it takes planning, it takes investment. Maybe there was a bit of lag to getting them started, but there is, as I said, there's so much underway, and that again will make a huge impact. So it must have been about a year ago now, I was talking to a real estate company, and one of his clients was looking at a manufacturing facility, and they were looking at southern Vietnam or Thailand. They were very, very keen and very interested in Vietnam. Mainly, one of the main reasons, and I touched on it before, was to do with the labour costs. Because obviously labour costs for a manufacturing facility are going to be one of your highest, if not your highest. But they chose to go to Thailand because of the infrastructure, because of how easy it was to move what they just manufactured and produced to other parts of Thailand, but mainly to the deep sea ports and to the cargo terminals of the airport. And that surprised me, but that's a reality, and that is something that, I mentioned it before, it's great having a competitive advantage of low labour, but labour, without a doubt, is going to rise. Of course it is, it does everywhere. So making sure that the infrastructure keeps up with your development is vital for future inward investment, particularly in manufacturing, but also in tourism. If people can't get around the country efficiently or quickly and they spend too much time traveling, they won't come back. And I think there is also a statistic with Thailand. People go back to Thailand 7 times. I think they come back to Vietnam twice. So things like that are important for many different sectors. It's all, it is all linked. And then the final one, intellectual property. Obviously, for large organizations, or any organization, but particularly global organizations, the intellectual property of their product or their service is vital and is part of their DNA, is part of who they are. And there have been challenges in the past with regulations and with them being enforced in Vietnam. And if you don't enforce something, that doesn't instill confidence. And if you don't instill confidence, then that has an impact on how people view, and when they're looking at 2 or 3 different options, if certain aspects are more enforceable in other countries, and that is on a high priority for this organization, then you may lose out on that investment. So that is something that is being looked at and has been looked at. Now, as I said before, all of these challenges these are not necessarily, they're not unique to Vietnam. Every country goes through these. But things are happening. Things are happening at pace, and they have to because Vietnam is growing so quickly. But there are some that are certainly more important than others. I think the regulatory barriers is something that we definitely hope to see improvement on, because that has a direct impact on trade. That is how trade comes in and out. So I certainly hope that we see more of that. But it's clear to see that the growth will continue at the rate we've seen in the last 2 years or so, if not even more. The government has huge aspirations. They're setting high targets. FDI still sees Vietnam as a very, very good destination. And I think if some of the challenges get improved a little, we will see an exponential increase in investment. And I particularly hope that we see that in renewables. The UK, we're doing, there's a lot of work and a lot of talk about what is happening in the renewables market. And I know that there will be a big UK presence when that eventually when the button gets pressed. Okay, so that's the kind of economic and trade side. So I just wanted to close and just finish, and should have probably done this at the beginning, but just to give a bit of context as to who we are, what is BritCham, and how we fit into the picture that I've just been talking about, the picture that I've just been painting in the future. So BritCham is an NGO, so we're a non-governmental organisation. We're a not-for-profit organisation. We essentially are a membership organisation. So we have about 200 members, organisation members. Most of those have a British link. They're either a British registered company or they have British people working for them. But we also have Vietnamese, direct Vietnamese companies. For us, if you are doing business in Vietnam, you can be a member of our chamber. Now, why is that if we're the British Chamber? Because our full name is the British Chamber of Commerce in Vietnam. And what's best for our organisation and what's best for our members is as wide, as large, and as diverse member base as possible, for the reasons that I'll give now about, so what is our reason of being? What do we do? So we're a membership organisation, so we support our members in whatever they wish us to support them in, which gives me a headache on most days because we have about, as I said, 200 organisation members, all with a slightly different priority, or with a slightly different objective, or with a slightly different way of how they want to achieve that, how they want to be involved, slightly different budget. And as we all know, sadly in life, you can't please everyone. So we look at what is happening in Vietnam, we look at what our strengths are, and we focus on those. So we do a lot of events. They range from CSR events to networking events to sector-specific events, business topic events, advocacy events. We do a lot of advocacy. So we work with our companies, we work with the UK government, we work with the Vietnamese government. As I said before when we were talking about being consulted, there is so much happening. And the Vietnamese government is talking to governments and it's talking to our members, it's talking to the big organisations. We have a group called the British Corporate Advocacy Council, the 10 leading UK companies in Vietnam. They will be responsible for billions of dollars of Vietnam turnover and employ thousands and thousands of people. Companies like AstraZeneca, Unilever, Prudential, Standard Chartered, HSBC, KPMG. So they talk to us, so we talk to our members. What would you like to see happen? CSR, corporate social responsibility, giving back to the community. That is a huge part of what we do. Yes, we are a business organisation, but we're also part of the community. So actually our biggest events in both Ho Chi Minh and Hanoi are fun runs. So, and the Hanoi fun run is actually just down the road. The Hanoi fun run is in Eco Park around the BUV, British University Vietnam complex, and that happens in November. So I expect to see at least half of you there this year. And the one in Ho Chi Minh is happening actually in 6 weeks' time. We get about 6,000 people coming to those. And the other thing I think I would say is you don't have to do a business event for it to be business. We connect people. We create networking experiences. That is probably one of the basics, one of our core values. It's networking, it's connecting people. We have 5 working groups now of our more important sectors. So we have education, energy, financial and professional services, ESG, and we're about to start a tech working group as well. They're the focal points for those sectors at BritCham, whether that is networking, connecting, advocacy, best practice, knowledge sharing, moaning, understanding what other people are going through. Now that's for a sector, and it's made up of obviously individual companies that might be actually in competition with each other day to day. But as we're all aware, where Vietnam is now, if the sector works together, everyone is going to benefit. So that is what we encourage from our working groups. And then the other side of what we do, which I also touched on, is we offer business services mostly to UK companies who are looking to do business in Vietnam, start business in Vietnam, and we can help them with business services. So I'm actually going back to the UK in 10 days' time, visiting 5 cities in the UK on a trade roadshow organised by the UK government. So I will be singing the praises of Vietnam and telling people why they should be exporting here, why they should be setting offices up here. So we are very active bilaterally. I work quite closely with an organisation called Viet Pro in the UK, which is an organisation of young professionals who are either end of their studies or working in Vietnam. I work with an organisation called SV UK, Student Vietnam UK, Vietnamese students studying in the UK. So yes, our concentration is Vietnam, but obviously we talk a lot to the UK. On that note, I will say thank you very much for being so attentive. I only saw one yawn, so thank you. If you have any questions, I am very happy to answer them, or very happy to talk individually afterwards. But thank you, Dr. Cyrus, again. Thank you, Brighton College, for having me here. And yes, thank you.